You get to hold us accountable for what we say by asking us questions, and we engage in this important process of discussion, debate, dialogue. It has to be participatory, though. You've got to participate. You've got to ask good questions, and we'll do our best to give you good answers. This is a process of empowerment. This is a process in which we collectively will empower ourselves with knowledge and information, and in doing so, lift ourselves out of what I call the mass of the ill-informed and ignorant, who, from their ignorance, are susceptible to fear, being afraid. What are you afraid of? You're afraid of that which you do not know, that which you do not understand. And now, why is this all relevant? When I walked in here, I had the opportunity to talk with some of the young ladies in the back. And she asked a question. She said, you're the guy that was in Iraq that did that weapons inspection stuff. I said, yeah, that's right. She goes, and there weren't any. And I said, that's right. Why are we there still? That's a hell of a question, ladies and gentlemen. We went to war because we were told there was a threat, an imminent threat, to our national security in the form of weapons of mass destruction, and that all venues had been exhausted in seeking to eliminate these weapons, the venues, of course, being the United Nations weapons inspection process. And because these venues had been exhausted, because these weapons were still alleged to be in Iraq, and more importantly, because of the post-9/11 environment that existed in the United States of America, in which we were attacked by forces which we did not understand, thereby generating tremendous amounts of fear, our government was able to exploit this fear, exploit this ignorance, and get us marching off to a war in Iraq, which we are still fighting today. Now, hopefully, in every state of the Union, with the exception apparently of Pennsylvania, the debate of weapons of mass destruction is over. With all due respect to the honorable senator from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. None. Zero. There were a couple hundred decrepit, aging, useless, non-viable artillery shells produced well before 1991, but when I look at the roles of weapons inspectors and those who I could say constitute experts in the field of weapons of mass destruction, with all due respect to Mr. Santorum, his name is not on that list. The President of the United States did not send hundreds of thousands of America's finest men and women, those who honor us by wearing the uniform of the armed services of the United States of America. He did not send them to Iraq to dispose of 500 old, rusty, useless artillery shells. We know why the President sent them to Iraq. He said so over and over again. He said that he knew that Saddam Hussein had massive stockpiles of chemical weapons. He said he knew Saddam Hussein had massive stockpiles of biological weapons. He said he knew that Iraq was reconstituting its nuclear weapons capability. And he said that Iraq maintained a viable active force of long-range ballistic missiles and, more nefarious, remotely piloted vehicles that could deliver these weapons to the shores of the United States and threaten the nations that call themselves friends of the United States. That's why we went to war, ladies and gentlemen. That's the only reason why we went to war, at least as stated by the Commander-in-Chief. Therefore, today, when the CIA, when the Defense Intelligence Agency, when the Senate Select Intelligence Committee acknowledges that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, again, Mr. Santorum, you don't count. When those powers that be acknowledge that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that all weapons of mass destruction in Iraq had been destroyed since the summer of 1991, and that no effort had been undertaken by Iraq to reconstitute any aspect of its program since that time, and that this fact was known by the United Nations inspectors and the U.S. Intelligence Committee, that young lady's question becomes all the more relevant. Why are we still in Iraq? because it had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction ever. It was never about the weapons. It was about getting rid of Saddam Hussein. Now, why is this important? Because there's three questions that we seek to answer today, or at least to begin down the road of trying to divine an answer. Why are we in Iraq? How do we get out of Iraq? And how do we stop ourselves from getting into Iran? Some would say that these are three totally separate questions. I say no, that the answer is found in reflecting on the fact that we went to war based upon a lie that has been exposed, yet we are still at war. Why? Did Saddam Hussein constitute a threat to the United States of America worthy of the loss of a single American life? The answer is no. Not one American life was worth getting rid of Saddam Hussein, because he did not pose a threat to this country in any way, shape, or form. And yet we went to war. Why? If it's not about national security, what's it about? And the answer is domestic American politics. You see, American politicians thrive on exploiting the fear that is generated from the ignorance of the American people. And with all due respect to the American people, the most highly technological nation state in the history of the world, we are populated by the single most ignorant people on the planet about the planet we live in. And from this ignorance comes fear, fear that is exploited by politicians who have an agenda that is not based upon the will and intent of the American people. No, we the people abrogated our role as citizens a long time ago, when only 35% of the eligible electorate participates in national elections. Who then is electing those who represent us in higher office? And more importantly, who is holding them accountable for that which they do in our name? And the answer, sadly, is not we the people. We the people have wrapped ourselves in a cocoon of comfort. We have ceased functioning as citizens. We function solely as consumers. And we are addicted to a consumer lifestyle. And all the politicians have to do is continue to feed this addiction by keeping us wrapped in this cocoon of comfort, keeping us waddling down a relative path of prosperity, and we, the people, don't want to rock the boat. And whenever we rear our ugly heads and say, I have a question, the politicians will bash this down. We had an important moment in global history in the early 1990s with the demise of the former Soviet Union. The United States-Soviet threat conflict called the Cold War had dominated the world for decades. Now the Soviet Union was gone. One would say that any rational player would say, shouldn't this be a time for the United States to reevaluate how we interface with the rest of the world? Think about it. The ultimate expression of national hubris, if you're an American, is the notion that 300 million Americans get to dictate the terms of coexistence with billions of other people around the world. And yet that's what's happening. But if somebody say, well, wait a minute, let's rethink this. We can't rethink it. We have to sell a policy of global hegemony. I'm not making up these words. Those who have created the current policies being pursued by the Bush administration used global hegemony themselves. But how do you sell global hegemony to an American people? Do you be honest with them and say that we are going to become the new Rome? That we will take your sons and daughters who enlisted in the armed forces, took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and we will disregard that oath and send them off to fight wars of imperial aggression, where we, freedom-loving America, occupy sovereign states brutally with total disregard to international law for the sole purpose of acquiring the materials we need to feed our addiction to the consumer lifestyle. Are the politicians going to be honest and say this? No.